it's been around a very long time, much, much longer than psychology. But in the beginning of physics, there was lots of theories to explain motion and pressure and all of those kinds of things. But over the thousands of years that people have been scientifically investigating physics phenomenon, we're really down to some pretty solid kind of rules and laws that govern motion and all of those kinds of things. Well, psychology is a young field, so we have many theories to try and explain almost the same thing. And what I would encourage you to do is um, instead of thinking of these as competing theories, what I would encourage you to do is think of them as complementary, where one leaves off, the other one picks up. Some explain some stuff, some explain others about human behavior and mental processes. But probably a good place to start is with a couple macro theories. When we talk about macro theories or what we call theories of science, these are theories that kind of guide what we kind of what we how our mindset is about how we're going to investigate something and what will lead to kind of the ultimate answer or the ultimate conclusion that would satisfy a person's need to know about a given thing. And probably a good place to start as far as macro theories is evolutionary theory because it's been used quite a bit to explain. I can tell you in my field of social psychology, it's been used to explain, for example, why we're social beings, but also why we're so aggressive with each other at times as part of a bonding, but also survival mechanism. So, but to just kind of for now, what I want to do is just give a kind of an overview of what evolutionary theory is all about, starting with the definition, and that is the gradual development of something, especially from simple to more complex. And this is an important point, is that we find that if we look at the origins of pretty much any organism, it usually started with a simple, if we want to put it this way, single-celled thing. And then over time, it slowly became more and more and more complex. So if we put human existence on evolutionary line, we probably started as a bunch of muck in water and then eventually evolved into simple and then complex cells and then land dwellers and so on. And that's kind of the idea of what we call empatry, is that everything usually starts from simple and becomes more complex. And I also this is not an evolutionary thing because evolution is over thousands of years. But when we get to human development, we'll kind of see this idea that human beings, we start as children just simply learning about the world, about language, about others, and then life gets more complicated as we go through elementary school and then high school and then young adulthood and then middle adulthood and even within a lifespan, we can see this idea of evolving from simple existence, if you want to put it that way, to more and more complex as we age. Okay. Charles Darwin, of course, is the person famous for evolutionary theory. I should say that he actually wasn't the first to talk about evolution. But his Origins of Species was the first to make it to the printing press and really get across sciences and was actually read in theological places and all of those kinds of things to really kind of bring about this idea of the importance of evolutionary theory. Um, and I do think it's interesting just to make a comment on that. Just to make a comment on that is that the biggest critics of Charles Darwin was actually scientists. The theologians and the clergy were actually more accepting of evolutionary theory as potential mechanisms for, of course, God's plan. And so it's interesting today when we pit evolutionary theory against religion that in the beginning, religion and theology was actually very accepting of the ideas that Charles Darwin presented. In fact, Charles Darwin himself was a prude, religious person himself. So it's kind of an interesting things how things flop over a century or so. But anyways, a couple things that he talked about was the issue of natural selection, which is a process in which organisms get traits that better suit their environment, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So this is the idea that we pass on our genes to the next individual that was most successful in surviving within a given environment. And this leads to adaptation, traits that increase an organism's chance to survive and reproduce in particular environments. Okay. And again, when we get to learning and what section is that in? No, when we get to developmental theory, we're going to talk about a cognitive theory by Jean Piaget, wherein, oh, basically kind of the white European culture, it's always meant the highly educated abstracts thinker is the superior person. So you would think through adaptation and stuff that that those individuals would survive the best. But indeed, when we get to that, we will see that the most abstract intellectual doesn't survive best in every environment. Um, this idea that, well, I think I have it in here, this idea of survival of the fittest doesn't kind of work out, which I'll get to in a minute. The second book that he wrote after that one was The Descent of Man. Okay, and what he argued is that just like evolution, human evolution is like all species and have evolved over time, and that we have this common ancestry with other animals, particularly primates. But he did add something to kind of human evolution, what he called sexual selection. Darwin introduced the concept of sexual suggestion, suggesting that certain traits evolve because they provide an advantage to mate attraction and reproduction. So the people that we have sexual intercourse with, according to Darwin, are those individuals who we want our offspring to have the best traits of. Okay. We can probably already see some problems with this one, and we will talk about it when we get to the human relationship section of the class, but we'll get into that further. Natural selection in human traits and behaviors can be understood through the lens of natural selection, where advantageous traits passed on to offspring. One thing that we should note, so we pass on the traits that are most beneficial and survive the best. Something to just consider, though, and this comes from the examples I just gave from the Piaget cognitive development one, is Darwin never said survival of the fittest are the ones who will be successful in propagating their genes. No, indeed, in some situations, the kind of what you would consider the weaker species, the weaker group of the um, um, species is actually more successful. And I always kind of compare this to cross species comparison, right? We don't really give our dogs or cats and any kind of humanity or anything like that. We think of them as pets. Some of us think of them as our children, um, but we treat them as more of animals than we do of giving them human qualities for the most part. There's some of us that are extremist. Yet, if you think about survival rates, right, and we think about the recent pandemic, dogs and cats didn't get COVID or died from COVID. Our pets did just fine. Uh, they could carry the virus, but the virus could not affect them. So, if the biggest, strongest species in the house can get COVID and pass away from it, who is the stronger species in that given environment? Okay. And that's where survival of the fittest really, that I know it's a cross species comparison, but I'm hoping that it kind of highlights that not always in every situation is it the biggest, strongest dude in the room that is best fit for that environment. And maybe probably one of the better examples of this kind of survival of the fittest is Nazi concentration camps. Okay. So who survived the Nazi concentration camps? Believe it or not, it was actually the people who could think and wonder and imagine and those kinds of things. The outward survivalist, strong person, muscular, strong, they were all the first to die. Not because they were labored to death or they were chosen for the gas chamber. They couldn't handle that situation. And so that's an example of, again, the strongest survivalists don't always, in a given horrific situation, are the ones who survive that situation. Okay. So I just wanted to bring up those examples because it was actually a social Darwinist, and I'm sad that they use Darwinist terms, use survival of the fittest to propagate prejudice and discrimination by, of course, saying it's white Europeans that are the fittest. And if you are not a white European, then you will need to take care of you, or you need to be a servant, or those kinds of things. So, survival of the fittest has a very negative and dark history, um, to be said. All right. So that's the first theory, and I wanted to clear up some biases with the whole survival of fittest thing, but the idea of us evolving over time. When we get into next week, the biology section, we'll go over the evolution of the human brain as an example, and see how we have changed over thousands of years to where we are today. And that'll be a kind of a journey that will go on. Um, so when it comes now, let's get into kind of a macro theory of understanding the human mind. So evolutionary theory is this broad, this is how we got to where we are. Now let's talk about how do we understand it. And there's two really important individuals in the history of psychology that we should talk about. The first one is a person named Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt is accredited for being what's known as the father of psychology, because even though this is of debate, he was awarded with being the first to establish a scientific psychology lab in a university in Germany. So he's kind of been crowned as the father of modern psychology. Okay. But he gave us kind of some important methods and whatnot to think about when we're exploring the human mind. And I'm actually going to start with introspection. Okay. He used something called introspection as a method of studying experiences, asking participants to describe their thoughts, their feelings, and their sensations in very deep detail. And really, the main protocol of this is a person would come in and they'd be told that they're going to be presented with a word or some stimuli, and without thinking about it, you need to say the first things that came to your mind without censoring what came through. And probably one of the most famous type of studies was the study of color and mood. And so they went and researchers did this for many, many dissertations and whatnot. They'd go and say, okay, what I want you to do is tell me your first mood when I present you with this color. And so they would present red, and the person would say something, and they present white or yellow. And you probably have heard, certain colors promote certain moods and all of those kinds of things. Well, I can tell you that there's a library that probably can be filled with these kind of studies, and they all contradict each other. They all find different findings. Um, but with that being said, we will get into some behavioral studies that do show the effects of color. Do they affect our subjective feelings and emotions? The evidence is shaky. But this is the idea of introspection. The reason why I bring this up is this also becomes one of the main methods that people will use in the talking therapy and psychotherapy and counseling is they use an introspection method of wanting the client to do something that Freud and counselors call free association. And they ask questions and want to know the first things that come to their mind. What are they feeling? What are they experiencing? And this is one of the methods that was originally structured for the scientific lab area. The other thing I should note, though, is he also started the experimental method within psychology, and he felt that even though introspection seems very subjective, he used very grounded, controlled experiment settings in order to get to what he wanted to study. So, in the examples of color, he would kind of put kind of like a horse blinders on the person, so the only thing they could see is the color being presented, trying to get rid of any other sensations, and really saying that we need to create methods that can be duplicated to see if they hold. Okay. And then probably the more kind of way of understanding the mind that Wundt did was he introduced the notion of structuralism into psychology. What Wundt focused on was breaking down the mental processes into the most basic elements, which became the foundations of what is known as structuralism. Structuralism is the idea that if I know the structures of the mind, I know about that um, process. I know what that does. Okay. So, for example, in modern neuropsychology and neuroscience, they use a very structuralist approach to understanding brain processes. They say, okay, when someone is hearing, the temporal lobe starts to become very active. And so the temporal lobe explains hearing. Um, when I'm thinking about others, the prefrontal cortex becomes active. And so that explains identity and those kinds of things. And when those things are missing, those people lose that capacity to do that activity. So if you're really kind of one of those individuals that if you know the brain process, you know the emotion, feeling, behavior. This is a structuralist point of view. Okay. So that's structuralism, which has had a huge influence, especially within the field of neuroscience. The second person that we should talk about in this kind of beginning period of philosophies of science within psychology is William James. Okay, William James, if we were to ask if there was a father of American psychology, it would probably be William James. He was one of the first to write a textbook called The Principle of Psychology in 1890. Um, and it was one of the most influential books for up into the 1950s. In fact, I will tell you, if you go on with your doctorate degree, that was an assigned reading when I was doing my doctoral degree. So, but it was also one of the first to lecture in the United States and go around and do lectures to kind of promote the idea of the study of the mind. Okay. And he gave us kind of three kind of important concepts. And I'm going to start with the stream of consciousness. He's one of the first to argue that the mind is continuous and a flowing process rather than a series of isolated elements. Okay. When we get to consciousness, we're going to find out that our brain and our consciousness, no matter what state it is in a continued flow. It is active 24/7. And we often think, well, when we go to sleep, our brain goes to sleep. But in actuality, when we measure the brain at sleep, it actually becomes more active. Um, and so he said when we're studying things, we need to realize that this is a constant process, and all we really get is a snap in time, which may change from time to time. Okay. He also introduced one of our first theories of emotions, where he suggested emotions result from physiological responses to stimuli. Instead of our thoughts creating our emotions, he argued that emotions are a physiological process that then we interpret through our thoughts and our cognitions. Okay. And this has been kind of the basis of things like stress management, of understanding emotions and ideas. It is the basis of anger management, is that the body produces those feelings and emotions, and then it's up to us to then take control of our body and take control of ourselves in order to come over them. Okay. So that was kind of that had a major influence on the study of emotions and what produces them. Is it our thoughts or is it our body? And Carl Lang and William James argued that it's our body first and our thoughts second. Okay. But probably more going on from here is the idea of what is known as functionalism. Okay. James, this was very much an American kind of idea. If you think about the idea is that if we want a tool, we want to know that tool is going to work, right? If we're going to do something, we want to make sure that what we're using to do that has the functional ability to do that, okay? And so he came up with the school of functionalism. And basically, what he said is, I really don't care, for example, that the temporal lobe becomes active when someone can hear something. I want to know what the function of hearing is. What is its purpose? How does it serve us? He would argue that knowing that the prefrontal cortex becomes active when we're processing social things and our relationship with our social world, he would argue that, okay, cool, that happens, but what is the function of continued thought processes even when we're not in the presence of somebody, but we can still continue to think about others and ourselves? What is the function of that? What does it serve the human condition? So the functionalist approach goes, okay, yeah, cool, the brain, but what's its function? What's its purpose? Why do we have emotions like fear and sadness? And so that's the functionalist approach to understanding behavior and mental processes. Okay. Now, if you could probably guess, in more modern psychology, we take both a structural and a functionalist approach. Okay. My dissertation was much focus on functionalist idea of how does your identity and why does your identity influence your states of loneliness. I wanted to know the functional answer to that, but I still had to do a chapter on the brain activity when people are focusing on their identity and experiencing loneliness. Okay, so in modern times, we both want to kind of know what are those structures, but how does that give way then to what function it has for the person? Okay. All right. So if those are kind of over macro theories, what I want to go through is more schools of thought. Um, and we're going to start with, and we're going to go over these briefly because as we go through this semester, we'll go through them in more detail. But a good place to start, because he's probably one of the most famous figures in psychology, is with Sigmund Freud and his psychodynamic, also known as psychoanalyst approach to understanding the human condition. Okay. First, I do want to explain something about Dr. Freud so you understand his mindset when he developed his theory and why he believed that what drives most human behavior is unconscious needs and desires. And that's where we're going to go with psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory. Okay. Sigmund Freud actually went to school to be a serious science. He wanted to be a neuroscientist. In fact, his dissertation, I believe, was on the nervous system of a frog or something like that, some amphibian. And he studied under some of the great neuroscientists of the time. Unfortunately, when he graduated, none of the scientific societies of the time would let him in because he was Jewish. And so, because of prejudice, Sigmund Freud had to leave his wants for to be a scientist and went ahead and went into medicine. And of course, what does a neuroscientist go into when it comes to medicine? They go into neuromedicine, neurology as their main focus of practice. And in this field at the time, they do much of what neurologists do today. A person loses feeling somewhere, they go in and they do tests to figure out what biological processes made it so they lost that feeling. But at this time, especially, they also dealt with pains and feelings and things that can't be explained biologically. And probably the most common disorder during this time of Freud was something called hysteria. Hysteria was marked by severe emotional outbursts, moments of severe anger, maybe moments of a little bit of melancholy, and then outbursts again. Um, and at the time, it was believed that this was mainly a female disorder. So if you think, and that's why they come up with the term hysteria or histrionic, okay? Because hysta is the Greek word for female sexual organ. So, for example, if you go get a hysterectomy, you go and have the female sexual organs removed from the body, okay? And what it was believed is what was causing, this is where it gets a little bit out there and into fiction is that what it was believed at the time is that what caused these emotional outbursts was the female womb wandering around the body and creating havoc to the different body systems and making the person hysterical. Okay. So think about that next time you call someone you're being hysterical or you're hysterical. You're telling them that their womb is wandering around their body, bothering them. Something to think about. So, and so at the time, these are the individuals that Freud was mainly seeing. He also saw adult victims of abuse and some offenders and whatnot. And he started to formulate this idea of mental life because the women coming into the clinic didn't know why they were there. And so there must be something that that person does not know about and don't have access to. Okay. Now, to give kind of a societal bend on this, I want to make it clear the reason why the women were there is because the husband or the father told them that they had to go there. At this time, both in Europe and here in the United States, for a woman to go get any type of health care, they had to have permission of either their husband or their father. And so, if you could imagine a father or a husband thinks that they have an overly emotional wife, guess where they're going to end up going? So, Freud's interpretation probably had more to do with the social and legal aspects of the healthcare system than maybe they didn't have access to their why they were feeling the way they were feeling. Okay. And I should note too, in the 1950s, 1960s, a group of experimenters took the symptomology of hysteria as it was originally formulated, and they went and sampled a large portion of a population, and they found that actually men and women hysteria is present in both men and women. In fact, it's actually a little slightly more in men at 52% versus to 48% of women. Okay, so something to kind of ponder about our uh, society as it tries to grow up. Anyway, so back to Freud. He had this situation, and so he felt like that the job of the therapist, the job of the doctor, is to access some primitive aspect of the human brain and the human mind in order to help the individual understand why they do what they do. Okay. And he used evolutionary theory to propose that there must be some very basic drives that we're not consciously aware of that exist in all human beings, and that these drives are what drive most of our psychological world, most of the reasons why we do what we do. And he's going to come up with the idea that we have what's called a life death instincts. But an instinct is just something we're driven towards, and it's kind of broad to say life versus death. Those seem kind of vague. So he reduced these down to very specific human behaviors and mental processes. He's going to reduce the life instinct. If you have kids in the house, plug their ears. He's going to reduce the life instinct to sex drive. And he's going to reduce the death instinct to aggression. And what he's going to argue is that our main unconscious drives is to satisfy sex and to satisfy the need to be aggressive and protective. And everything that is a consequence are at a servant to those two basic unconscious drives. And then he argued that in order to make it so we survived as a species, because those two drives, we probably would have not survived very long if that's the only thing we did was have sex and then beat each other up, as he would argue. We develop what's known as the ego, and the ego has access to our external world, and its job is kind of as the executive to negotiate the social world and how to behave and act in it while still satisfying the primitive urges. Now, again, we'll talk more about this in the semester when we get to developmental psychology and personality psychology. But this is kind of the basic idea is that our unconscious world plays a large role in how we behave and how we act. Okay. If we fast forward to today, just kind of give you some research being done on how the unconscious world really operates and if it does exist, how much role does it play in our behavior is in neuropsychology and in learning psychology and experimental psychology. And we have found that most of our sensations, before they get to the higher areas of the brain, go through the limbic system, which is largely our unconscious seat. It's where our emotions come from, our natural response, our habit behavior, all of those things that after we do it, we go, why did we do that kind of thing come from that limbic system. And most all our sensory inputs go through there. And then a few seconds later, it gets to the higher area of the brain where we can start taking over conscious control. Okay, so to kind of explain kind of where we're at with this. So again, we have the limbic system, and I'm just going to crudely represent it with this little bulb. Okay, imagine your professor's art is good. Okay, and then on top of the limbic system, we have the cortex. Okay, all right. Looks like guy wearing a hat eating straw. Okay, but anyways, use your imagination, please. So when we get sensory information in, it goes to the limbic system. And then a few seconds later, it's set up to our higher cortical areas where we have our conscious experience of it. Okay. So I'm going to take you through kind of a trip on this. I'm willing to bet that 99.5% of us have wanted to just smack someone before. Maybe it's the way they looked, maybe it's something they said, maybe it's, whatever it may be, but I'm willing to bet that there's been that person where we went, oh, I just want to. And probably when that happened, before you even really understood it, your fist was tightening, your muscles were tightening, your breathing started to, and your heart started to race a little bit more. But what usually happens though is then we start to think, if I hit this person, there might be legal consequences. What is other people going to think? Is this the best decision for me? Should I really do this? And then we decide, okay, no, okay. And then we relax our hands and we shake away the sweat on the palms and we catch our breath and hopefully we just walk away. Sometimes we don't. We make it worse sometimes, but that's another story. What is happening in the brain at this point, okay, is one, that first initial response was an unconscious limbic response. It was your body preparing for fight or flight. The second one, when you started to think about, oh, what should I do? Should I really engage in that? This is when that information, oh, geez, was sent from the limbic system up to your higher cortical area. And in the prefrontal cortex, we have a neural tract, which I will put in blue, that kind of goes back to the limbic system that sends an inhibitory response to the limbic system saying, cool it, stop. You can't do this. And that's when your body starts to stop releasing cortisol, stops releasing epinephrine, all of those things that get you ready for to smack someone, we'll say. Okay. All right. So this is kind of where we are in understanding some, at least some unconscious processes and how they can influence behaviors. I should say, is there people who do not have this inhibitory neural tract? I will tell you that most individuals that we can study for this kind of thing are psychopathic serial killers. And we have found in the ones that we have been able to study who will let us study them, they do not, this inhibitory tract, when we put them in imaging machines, does not exist, meaning that they do not have the ability to inhibit that initial limbic response. What they can do with it is they can think about how they're going to go about doing what they're about to do. Okay. But they do not have the inhibitory neurons to inhibit their impulsive behavior. So that's something to consider when we think about these kinds of things. Okay, so that's unconscious and kind of some of the flavor of how it's being studied more in modern psychology, but that is Sigmund Freud. Now, I will tell you, we will go over his developmental theory and we'll see how popular culture has really taken off with that. And we'll talk more about this idea of unconsciousness and drives and whatnot as we move along through the course. Okay? All right, probably the next two figures that deserves a little bit of time right now is John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. And then after this, we're going to take a short break and come back and try and finish up, okay? So here in the United States, and this is purely an American type of psychology. Here in the United States, there was a growing dissatisfaction with psychoanalysis. In fact, it felt like we were kind of regressing back more into philosophy instead of being scientists and being good experimenters. And so a group of psychologists here in the United States decided that they needed to develop a psychology that was more like the natural sciences, that were be put under experimental control and physically observed. Okay. And like the natural sciences at the time, what can you observe in nature? While you can observe the stimulus in the environment and the response or behavior of the organism. And anything between that stimulus and response is not within the realm of psychology, that we shouldn't study mental processes. And for about 40 years here in the United States, this is what dominated American psychology is this understanding of reward, punishment, things like associative learning, and we'll really get into this field when we talk about learning and behavior change because they had a major influence on it. But the two people that we should mention are John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner on this. John B. Watson is known as the father of behaviorism because he wrote in the 19, I think, 20s or 30s, what's known as the Behavioral Manifesto, which established psychology as purely a behavioral, observable observation science, much like the natural sciences. So This is kind of the start of it. Um, and then B.F. Skinner is going to be the poster child. Okay. So let me kind of bring you through, though, some of Watson and a little bit of B.F. Skinner's ideas. John B. Watson is going to take some research done by Ivan Pavlov and some other individuals that looked at associative learning. And what Watson wanted to prove is that things like fear and phobias are learned, they're not inherited. Okay. So probably one of his most famous studies was what's known as Little Albert. And I'll just rehearse this very quickly for the sake of this conversation. The Little Albert experiment is where they took an infant because they didn't want a child or an adult who had experience, so they used an infant. And they presented the little infant with a little rat and even fire at one point and all these different objects. And what did little Albert do with them? Did what babies do. He would manipulate it, he would play with it, he tried to put it in his mouth, all of those kind of things that babies do. He didn't present any fear. So what Watson did is he then paired the presentation of the white rat and then did a bong behind little Albert's ear. And what did that do? It gave little Albert a startle response. Okay. And he continued to pair the rat with the bong, rat, bong, rat, bong. And then eventually he just presented the rat, and little Albert had a fair response just to the presentation of the little rat. And it then spread to generalize to anything kind of white and fluffy, like a white pillow or other animals that are white and fluffy. It started to generalize. Okay, so here we have the idea of fear and phobias being conditioned. All right, for this part, we'll just fast forward really quick to certain type of treatments. How do you get rid of a conditioned response? You do repeated exposure to that fear or trauma creating response. So how do you get rid of a snake phobia? You expose people to snakes. And I don't know why I always use snakes. Anyways, and so I do want to just note though, does this work? Currently, the best treatment modality for post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, phobia, social phobias are all exposure therapy based. Yes, I even said post-traumatic stress disorder. We find that when we expose, for example, combat veterans to war zone scenes over and over and over, their symptoms start to abate. So this is something that kind of grew up into more of a modern version of it. We don't immediately expose and we'll get into exposure therapy and how it works in a modern way later in the course, but that's kind of one of the influences. Something I should note about John B. Watson is when he was doing the Little Albert experiments, he also was having an affair with his graduate assistant that was helping him. Okay. And afterwards, the university he worked for said either you dump your graduate assistant or you leave university. Okay. Now, I feel sorry for his wife. I really do, because what he chose is to leave university and divorce his wife and marry his graduate assistant, which in the end, I think is an interesting story of love, because it is said that John B. Watson spent his last 10 years in isolation and sadness and depression when his second wife passed away. He couldn't deal with that loss, and that's eventually what he passed from. So maybe there was more to this story than just infidelity and whatnot. But what did John B. Watson do when he left university? He had two huge influences on marketing and parenting. Okay. Before behaviorism, it was believed that babies were born with their complete capacities. They were basically born as miniature adults. The only thing that we need to nurture is their physical abilities, their language abilities, and all of those things. But they already have what they need to be who they're going to be. Um, but that doesn't fit the rules of behaviorism because behaviorism assumes that your behaviors are due to reward and punishment and making a mistake or doing something right. And it's shaped by the environment and by stimuluses in the environment and how the organism responds. So John B. Watson especially was famous for saying, "Send me your child. I will use the rules of conditioning and learning to make your child into whoever you want them to be, whether it be the garbage man, the next Supreme Court justice, an attorney, or a doctor. I will make them into who you want." B.F. Skinner took this to extreme. You'll notice in this picture, he has these pigeon training things. It's called a Skinner box, where he trains pigeons. He actually created a human-sized one that, yes, he did have the intention of putting a child in it, but fortunately, Health and Human Services came in and said, no, you're not. So fortunately, the human pigeon B.F. Skinner box was never used. But that's how extreme they thought. But Watson wrote a book, and guess what? He said, Mom, you as the primary person are responsible for how your child turns out. Parents, you are responsible because you set up the environment for the child. And if your child doesn't turn out who they should be, that's on you, not the child. And if you think about the American parenting experience, this is really kind of the attitude that has developed over the years based upon this stimulus response association. Okay. So that had an influence on parenting. The influence on marketing is that he argued that he was originally, just real quick, he was hired by a coffee company. And back then, what producers believed is that if you're going to increase sales, you have to increase the quality of your product. And products were just put in basic labeled containers, nothing fancy, nothing anything. And he kind of went in and said, no, 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 no. You don't need to increase the quality of your product. You need to increase the appeal. And so he kind of did these taste studies where he had the same exact coffee, one in their regularly labeled can and the other one in a nice fancy uh, designed can. And he did taste tests and asked them which coffee they preferred. Even though it was the same coffee, people always said that the one in the fancy can was far superior than the other. And indeed, when they changed to the fancy can, their profits soared, and he became very wealthy off of it. Um, and this is kind of some of the reasons why, for example, your Apple device comes in that little fancy container. I also call this the macaroni and cheese effect, where people will swear that Kraft macaroni and cheese is superior to generic macaroni and cheese. Even though next time you go to the grocery store, look at the back and look at where they've been manufactured, and they usually come out of the same manufacturing plant. But people swear on it. Even I do on that. So he had a huge influence on marketing by saying you just need to increase the appeal, not the quality. So for better or ill, that's some of the legacy from John B. Watson. B.F. Skinner, I'm going to leave this at this just so that there's some memory reminders, a kind of a extreme story to remember these individuals. Is B.F. Skinner actually developed the first precision bomb. What he did is he trained a pigeon on a map to where if it pecked the target, and that's how the pigeon got food. And then they flew the pigeon over the place where it was being targeted, and the pigeon would peck the bomb, and the bomb's wings and everything would then guide the bomb to where the pigeon was pecking. Um, and this is kind of an interesting history in humanity. The bombs were never actually put into service because there was so much outcry that this poor pigeon was going to be blown up, which I always find interesting because of the hundreds and thousands of people that were killed by that bomb, but we were concerned about a pigeon. Okay. Something to kind of think about humanity. But gang, I've been going for a long time and I know it's a little overwhelming. Is it okay? I'm going to stop my sharing and I'm even going to stop the recording. Is it okay